Kia ora, and welcome to Simon Says. My name is Simon Jenga, and it is a pleasure to bring you this conversation talking about Te Tiriti or Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, the principles of the treaty, the current principles of the treaty bill, and some things in between. It's a great conversation. It doesn't cover everything. Myself and my guest are not experts in this space, but we do enjoy talking about it, exploring the ideas, and hopefully you find the conversation interesting enough. Enjoy. Well, thanks for coming on and agreeing to have a sit down and have a chat. It's a pretty interesting time, and you and I talk about this fairly often, which is why we've ended up in this conversation. So I'm very much looking forward to exploring some of the issues around the treaty, conversation points. But
a bit of a light topic.
A bit of a light topic, yeah. For what are we, a Tuesday? I don't know.
Yeah,
a Tuesday
classic
afternoon.
Tuesday convo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, what's the role of the treaty principles in New Zealand society?
Super easy.
Yeah.
I think we can smash it out in probably an hour.
We can smash it out. Look, I've got no.
So, okay,
what are we, 200 years in?
Yeah,
can we smash it out tonight?
Yeah, it'd be done. It'd be done, dusted. So, Dan, you are a local business owner.
Yep.
You have been in Tauranga for a while, but you've come up from down south.
Yep.
But you've got heritage here in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But what is your heritage?
My heritage is Pākehā. So yeah, I come from that kind of thinking. But also I had the privilege of being born here in Tauranga Moana and raised in Whakamarama, in the beautiful village of Whakamarama in sort of North Tauranga Moana area. And yeah, so my heritage is based around being part of a very cool community where Māori were just are a very active part of the community. So if you're in Whakamarama, you know that you are part of a community that's existed for many hundreds of years, not just with European, people in it, but also that's been used and inhabited and loved and cherished and owned by Māori for a long time. So without knowing it, I was luckily raised and born in Whakamarama in an area that is part of the Hapu Pirirako and Ngāi Ranginui, all of Tauranga Moana. Pretty lucky to kind of be exposed to a lot of different iwi and hapu in that area. And then the really cool thing is that I had no say in this, but my mum, who was pretty just open-minded, was pretty keen on learning, the local language. So she enrolled in Te Reo Māori university courses, and as part of that, Kohanga Reo, which is the preschool for, it's preschool-ish, but it is that preschool age implementation of Māori as an immersive language experience for, Māori and New Zealanders. And yeah, we just at very young age, I was put into that and very naturally learnt that as my main language alongside Te Reo Pākehā, Te Reo Ingarihi. So learnt English and Māori fairly consecutively because Mum was quite active in the marae where the Kohanga Reo was happening. Yeah.
But she wasn't Māori herself.
Not at all.
No, interesting. And no Māori up the tree.
No,
so
not at all.
Was her generation the first in your family to really engage?
Definitely.
With tikanga and
Yeah,
te reo?
she was, but she was part of a generation that was really starting to question. Loved my granddad, but he had some pretty old school views of I found it quite jarring when he first ever mentioned the difference between Māori and Pākehā, and I'd never really thought about it because where I grew up, it was just not a thing. And I look back and I see that's quite a privilege. I grew up in a really cool environment where, Māori was not resurgent, it was surgent. It was very there.
As in almost the dominant in that community?
It was just
Or just
normal.
not even a thing?
It was just normal.
Yeah.
And, I mean, look, very colonised, and I'm not taking away from the fact that there's a lot of, hardship, but by the 80s and 90s, I was growing up, I didn't question it. I mean, just everyone I knew was from a Maori family. Like, half were, half weren't. I didn't really think about it. But the really cool thing is that Maori dripped off my tongue as easily as
Yes.
English.
Yes.
So it's so funny because our natural words for a lot of things were Maori. They weren't English, and a child doesn't make that distinction. They're learning how to communicate as a human, and I just grew up in a really cool community where look, it wasn't easy for Maori, and I know looking back it was actually hard in the community I lived in. So I don't want to whitewash that at all. But what was really cool was that the community was just really engaged by people who had been there for hundreds of years prior to all of the immigrants that turned up there. And I was unaware of the politics, but I just grew up in this awesome, sort of melting pot of Māori and English, and didn't really question the difference.
Did you find, were you identified as Pākehā within that community?
Looking back, yeah, 100%. Definitely, yeah. But I don't know. It wasn't until I got older I started to see the differences. But I got to say, back then that was where my passion for Maori myth and legend and just history began, and it never stopped. We were really lucky to have people in our community that conveyed really cool stories, old kaumatua, kuia, and I was really, really blessed to have that, because a lot of my origin stories were based around old Maori figures and things that were pre-colonial, and myth, legend, story, regalia, things around Maori tradition, te ao Māori and tikanga Māori, and the idea of koha was a Māori word and a Māori idea, but I was really lucky that I was brought up in a world where the idea of koha and manaakitanga, like hospitable respect between one party to another, was not a taught thing. It was in the culture.
A shown thing.
It was just there.
Yes.
And that's cool. And it's actually really hard to put into English words the idea of showing that respect to your visitor, and that respect for interchange. That is very hard to put into words, because it's an integral part of Māori tradition on the marae, between hapu, between whānau, between people. It underpins so much. It's not just that, but it's what that world pertains to, and the world that legal contracts belong to. As much as you automatically think of that as your basis for exchange between parties in a business environment, that's how automatic that thinking is, and that interchange between humans, between people, between groups, between families. And my mum somehow managed to really comprehend that really early, and raised us in an environment where we just embraced a lot of very cool tikanga, and I took it for granted. And I look back and I'm going, I'm stoked. I'm stoked I was raised in that, because I actually find being around te ao Māori, the marae culture, any sort of culture where there's hui, kōrero, it just makes sense. And it's really hard. And I don't want to go on too far here, but further to the background, I left Tauranga, I moved to Auckland, yada yada, and I went to high school and we had to study a language, and I remember just picking Māori because I was like, halfway there. I went in, and then within weeks it was this weird sensation of like, I suddenly knew so much, and it was like part of me was awakened. As a Pākehā man living in a Pākehā world, I moved there, and all of a sudden, like that whole Te Ao Māori just came so naturally, and I'm really blessed because it's really awesome to have that exposure as a young kid, because it's been really easy to cross both worlds.
When you raised quite an interesting point there about it's hard to put into words in English, the connections between people, and how we interact with respect, how we engage not only in our own homes but out in the community.
Yeah.
And probably like because there wasn't a written language in Māori before colonial influences, that really, it made it quite visceral, that was the way that you showed your respect for people, you showed your care and attention through action, and through these kinds of exchanges, but it wasn't through the written. So like the written and what I do day in, day out of writing contracts and interpreting contracts, that's a very new thing for New Zealand in terms of reducing it down to words and really being held to those words, so that if it is in writing,
it's a new
thing for the world, I think.
For people.
Yeah. Like we're really only talking the last, I don't want to put myself to a number, but I would guess, let's say the 1400s, 1500s, in terms of modern,
as a legal basis.
in terms of the whole world, because before that there was scholarly folks who were doing scholarly works, and they were running a lot of core shows, and but the people weren't. The people weren't engaging with the written word, and actually for a long period of time, it was those institutions tried to stop people from being able to read
as being the dominant way to engage in an agreement or a contractual basis with people. It's recent.
Yes.
You know, there are little communities throughout the world, you know, throughout the Levant, throughout Egypt, throughout India, throughout China, for over the last 1,000 years, communities where the written contract was the legal basis to enter an agreement with people. But overall, I mean, what, we're talking 500-600 years for it to become the way.
Yes. So having had that, like having grown up in that way and being exposed to that, now that you're in business and like you do things based on the contractual word, like do you find that quite challenging to force yourself or to transition into that you need to have it written down?
I think most people, no. I mean, we're way past that. I don't think anyone really struggles with that now. And
the cultural zeitgeist has moved on from
it did
from expecting
really
not to
quickly.
need to.
I actually think it really did quickly. Like Māori have demonstrated a very quick study approach to legal frameworks very early.
I think so.
Well, prior to the treaty, there were written deputations from Māori to the Crown.
Well, the United Confederate of Māori Tribes
really got it early.
And they. I think it's really condescending to look back on New Zealand history and assume that Māori didn't know what they were doing. I think that's an oversimplification of.
If anything,
history.
There was incredibly ready uptake of literacy.
Yes.
An incredibly quick uptake of legal framework.
Yes.
It wasn't understood by everyone. It takes generations to do that, especially that automatic default thinking. But Māori demonstrated pre-treaty a need for a treaty. They expressed in no uncertain terms deputations that took months to travel from New Zealand to the UK to request a framework for which we could, work together.
Well, and immediately prior to the treaty, that was the game. It was acknowledge us as an independent nation of Confederate tribes.
That's right.
And I mean Henry Williams, he's way up in my family tree.
Oh,
but
really?
So I'm a direct descendant.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Which I was chatting to my mum about that recently, actually, and then she showed me the paperwork, and we've got the full family tree all the way back up.
An absolute legend champion of assuring Māori
100%
representation in Britain pre-treaty.
I mean, he was involved in
That's amazing.
in the Confederate documentation. and the translation of that, and then he was obviously involved in the translation of the treaty.
1838?
I want to say 36, but,
Yeah,
I feel like
1836,
maybe
I
it was
think, yeah.
later that it
No,
was...
no, I think it started in 1836. Could be wrong, but
Yeah.
but this is recognising that there was no framework in Aotearoa New Zealand for the acquisition and sale of land, and
Yes.
and Māori very quickly realised, whoa. We need proper framework here.
Yes.
And he championed that cause.
Yeah, and all the way through. I mean, even
Yeah.
after the treaty,
He resisted,
and then
yeah.
when there was all the, I was about to say kerfuffle, and then I was like, that's not the right word because it's a little bit more than a kerfuffle.
Just slightly. Yeah.
But I mean, he throughout that whole period, he
Yeah.
stayed true to supporting Māori and
many,
protested with them.
Many people did.
Yes.
Unfortunately, commercial interests and political momentum took over.
And force. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a really good example, I think, of where we're no longer in terms of like day to day for New Zealand. We couldn't imagine
No.
a forceful war right now. But then
no.
you look at what goes on in the rest of the world,
Well,
and it's like I can't believe that we're back to that.
Violent wars
Yes.
between Māori that tried to assert their treaty rights in the 1860s. It's only 20 years after the signing. That's not a long time.
No.
Those
It's not
people
even a
signed
generation.
it. No.
No.
The same people that signed it are going, hey, whoa. We're not living up to what we signed here. This is not what we agreed upon. And you had these, I mean, that's an oversimplification
Yeah.
because different people had different views, and not all Māori had the same view, not all colonists had the same views, we just discussed. But there's wars happening very soon after the signing of the treaty, and there's within that period, there's people challenging what the treaty meant
Yes.
and the extent of that, and what is our recourse.
Mm.
No recourse, because deputations to the Crown were New Zealand's its own country, deal with the New Zealand government, and the New Zealand government sanctioned, by and large, the wars of the 1860s, which is really, really important when you consider what the role the treaty plays today. So, yeah, I don't want to get there too soon,
Well, and,
but
and
I just
actually-
think like that's a huge thing to think about, acknowledge, and investigate.
Yeah, so before we go any further,
Yeah.
I think that brings up an important starting point, which is
Yeah.
that when we talk about the treaty, sometimes I find that there's an immediate reaction when you say the treaty or Te Tiriti, like as to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Do you find that those, whether you say it in Te Reo or whether you say it in English, that it's two different documents? Do you think of it as one thing?
I do. And I acknowledge people that don't. Te Tiriti o Waitangi it has so much meaning.
Well, you've got a political meaning where it's
Yeah.
used in a political context to distance oneself from the treaty, the English version. So you've got that
Okay.
under. Well, I think that there is like
Yeah.
at times it's
that's
used in a
interesting.
way of distancing.
Yeah.
But then also you've just got that's the version that most Māori signed. So out of the initial signing at Waitangi of 39-40 chiefs was the Māori
Yeah.
version.
Yeah.
The version that went around the country over that next year,
500
of the
plus
500
chiefs, yeah.
chiefs, only about 30 signed the English version. All
Yeah.
the rest signed the Māori version on the
But-
basis of people like Henry Williams.
But a lot of
explaining
people
it.
had an oral translation.
Correct. Yeah.
That was not necessarily just read out.
No.
It was an oral representation of the treaty. And I think it's disingenuous to kind of question the validity of that because we don't know what happened. No one has that
I
knowledge.
agree.
There are various stories, and I think it'd be wrong to not acknowledge the fact that, on the 5th of February, when they first read it out, many Māori were very suspicious in the Northland tribes. And there was one particular, chief that worked very hard, the Winston Peters of his time, if you may. That's not fair. But he was great, and he managed to get a lot of people on board with that. And the very next day, those 40 chiefs signed. The previous day, none of them wanted to sign it. Well, most of them were out, very suspicious.
Yeah.
But they had had 10, 20 years of suspicious behaviour. And the wording wasn't crystal clear. And it's not like the wording was there, but it was the intent of how enforceable is this?
Yeah.
When you've got a queen we've never met, Wikitoria, she's meant to enforce this. And as soon as they started having grievances, they wrote to Queen Victoria, Wikitoria, to sort it out. They saw her as the absolute advocate of their rights because they had formed an agreement with her, the Rangatira of the UK, and rightfully so. And I mean, it was early sort of mid 19th century. There was a lot going on for the UK. New Zealand wasn't like paramount in that thinking, and there was a lot of delegation. And in that space to New South Wales. New South Wales had the governor of New South Wales had the right to sort of intervene and adjudicate grievances. And right at the beginning you had questions about the interpretation of articles of the treaty. So
Yes.
Te Tiriti, the treaty, at the end of the day, at that time it was the same thing. I mean, and we want it to be the same thing.
I think it's
We don't want it
helpful
to
to
be
think
different.
of it as the same thing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
I mean, no one wants it to be different. We want the interpretation of Te Tiriti o Waitangi to be the same as the treaty,
Yes.
and to think there's two different interpretations is incredibly problematic.
It's hugely problematic. I mean, when you take it makes me think of places like France, maybe not France so much, maybe Canada's a better example.
Yeah.
Where the legislation books in Canada, the English and the French are written side by side. So all the legislation appears in both languages. Now that to me is like, imagine if all of our laws were in English and Te Reo. And and how many disagreements we would have over the interpretation of specific words, how they're being translated between the two, which one is the one that's translated versus which one's the one that's the translation. I've never heard of a problem in Canada of interpretation of legislation based on the
language.
On the language.
Linguistics, yeah.
But that's kind of what we're dealing with.
The problem is in Aotearoa that we went 146 years of Māori not being recognised as an official language.
Yes.
So in 1986,
a really valid
we
point,
had we had the treaty claim, which said that Te Reo Māori is a taonga, it's a treasure.
Yes.
And I forget the words, but it's like ka ngaro te reo, ka ngaro taua, pērā te ngaro I te moa, which I'm pretty sure I got that right, but the gist of it is, when we lose the language, we lose us, the people.
Yeah.
Which is similar to when we lost the moa.
Yeah, right.
And the idea there is, without the language, you don't have the people, you don't have the culture.
Yes.
It is the essence. It is the wairo. It's the modi order. It's you know.
Well, it's the core of how you interpret the world. If you because and actually just to digress slightly.
Yeah, sure.
Dad, he always, because I'm half Hungarian.
Hungarian.
Yeah, and so he's Hungarian, and he was born here in New Zealand. So he was he was technically second generation because he was born as like an infant here.
Okay.
But he hadn't been back to Hungary. He learnt a little bit of Hungarian from his mum, but really it was about assimilation when he was growing up. So it was about learning English.
Yeah.
When he went back to Hungary, and then he was trying to speak Hungarian with people locally, and he told me about how he wanted to speak the language, but he wanted to actually think in the language. And there was this real moment when he went from hearing someone say something in Hungarian, interpret it into English in his head, think about his answer in English, translate it into Hungarian in his head, and then say it in Hungarian, as opposed to hearing Hungarian, thinking Hungarian, speaking Hungarian. And I think that that's part of what you're saying, as well as that the language is how you experience the world, and it's easy to forget that the language you're thinking in is then how you're thinking about the world.
Well, like we say the word reo, meaning the Māori language. Reo means language, right? But it doesn't. It's very, very hard to properly translate the word reo.
In what sense?
Like, it's similar to mana. So the Māori word mana, you know, I've never met anyone that can give me a satisfactory translation into te reo ingarihi, like English language, of the word mana. Someone has mana and they don't. Certain things that somebody does
Certain things
like certain things you do really build mana.
Yeah.
And things work against mana. Some people's history, their standing, the way they speak has mana. And some things don't. But don't try and give me an English word that means that.
But are we
Because
building
there's
that?
not.
But are we building that up in the Māori language?
Okay.
Because there's words in English
no.
that are difficult to translate.
Yes, but same in German,
Yeah.
right? Like Schadenfreude. The German word for that, amazing satisfaction when you see your enemy like embarrassed or something really bad happen to someone you kind of hate, or like you like but want to see them fail. Like, I
Which of
don't
course
know an
we
English
never
word for that.
experience.
Like for us, we're like, I was secretly just stoked when that happened. Like when the Wallabies lose to Scotland.
I'm married to an Australian. I have to like the Wallabies now.
No,
What's a
no,
better-
but secretly you
when the
have
English
Schadenfreude.
lose, yeah, I can get on with that. Yes, you're
Yeah.
right. Yeah,
No,
yeah.
no, like you will in the living room be like, oh wow, I can't
Oh,
believe they lost.
shucks.
But you're gonna be going, bloody Aussies. Like, you know, there's just something about that, like weird satisfaction, and they have that name. They also have a name, and I don't know what it is, but it's that smell when you walk into the forest with rotting leaf matter on the ground that gives you this awesome sense that you're in nature.
Yeah.
Okay, that's about 100 words or whatever it is, but in German they've got a word for that. Okay, every language has their own way to ascribe something culturally idiosyncratic, like pertains purely to that culture. And the word reo, you think, oh, it means language. But actually, the word language and reo, when you
So what? But
when
what
you go
more
to a
is it?
marae, I'll tell you this. Have you ever been to a marae and you've seen like beautiful carvings and there's like a beautiful ancestor on the top of the marae, on the wharenui, and they're like, they've got this tongue poking out. Do you know what that tongue represents? It's really hard to put into words, but many, many things. But one of them is the power of speech, reo. But it also means mauri. It means that person's essence. It also means their virility. So it has like a, you know, ancestral, sexual, it has power. So there's this ancestor with this large tongue coming out, and you're like, oh man, I can see that. But what it means is the power of communication, the power to speak, the power of language, the power of words, but also the power of their personal mana and virility. So what is reo? Reo is language, but when you go into marae and you look at that, and you look at that tupuna who's represented in that carving above the wharenui, and you hear about their old tupuna that lived there, and you listen carefully to the stories of the kaumātua as they describe up on the marae, this is our founder, this is our people, this is the people that formed our marae, this is our main people that we ascribe to in our hapu, and they formed us, they are us, and we are their essence, they are our essence. And the word reo is just not equally translatable to language.
Okay, so here's the problem.
It's
though.
so much more.
Yeah, but what you just did was you did translate it. The problem with saying it can't be translated is, on the one hand, it's you've got to take it super seriously and you've got to respect it and hold it here. Oh, but you don't get it, and I can't explain it to you.
You can get it.
Yeah, so I think that's where
Yeah.
a lot of the problem with it can't be translated into English comes from, is that
Yeah.
it has to be achievable if you want people that don't speak
Okay.
Te Reo to be able to
I
understand
hear
the
what you're
importance
saying.
of it. And what you just did, I could feel how viscerally the words that you were saying, how much they meant. And then that stirs in me a response, which then allows me to learn reo. And one day maybe I'll understand it to the extent that you do.
Like, I don't think that language is separable. Like, translation is not separable from culture. So if you want to succeed in culture, language, you need to have a degree of understanding there's a different culture that goes with that. So in Māori, the way to disseminate, the way to separate those things is tikanga and reo. So reo Māori, you know, he aha te mea na nui i te ao. What is the most important thing in the world? English, you know, the response, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is people, it is people, it is people. And that is a nice thing that most humans can relate to, because it's a really timely reminder to bring your focus back to the fact that, guys, we're not just sending emails, we're not just fighting a legal battle. What is at the crux of this? It is the people, you know? And I think that's really beautiful. Here's another one. Ka kore te kumara e kōrero ana mo tōna akereka. As a translation, that just says, the kumara does not go around speaking of its own sweetness. You know, it doesn't take a genius to go, I
get that.
The kumara is sweet. And if you give it the long game, most people realize the kumara is sweet. But the actual subtext is, let other people speak your praise. Now is not the time to do it. Play the long game. And if you really are who you think you are, and you've got that mana and self-respect, take a back seat and you'll see your thing happen. But don't, it's not your job or your family's job to promote you.
I heard a really good thing on that, which was that whakatauki are Māori proverbs and sayings.
Yeah.
And that in English we have whakatauki.
We do.
Most
cultures do.
And most cultures do.
Yeah.
And it's all those kinds of things. The early bird
Don't
gets
blow
the
your
worm.
own trumpet.
Don't blow your own trumpet.
Yeah.
These
And
are all
look,
colloquialisms. And
but
really,
they have so much culture.
they do. And a good
You
one
can't
I've got.
take it out of it, right?
Because there's serious ones and there's not serious ones.
Yeah.
Like sweet as.
Sweet
as is such a
Yeah.
classic. I remember sitting on a bus with an American, and
they think you
and he
said
said,
their
"How you
arse was
doing?"
sweet?
And I said, "I'm sweet as," and he turned to me fully serious and said, "Sweet as what?" And it was so good. It was such to me it was such a dad joke, because I was like, "All right, Dad, chill out."
Yeah, chill out, Dad.
But to him, he
Yeah.
was just like, "Sweet as what?" So those
How are you?
little...
I'm hungry. Oh, hi, hungry.
Yeah,
My name's Dad.
yeah. There you go. So yeah, you're like, language comes with shared experience that then informs how we speak, because the
does.
words themselves
Yeah.
can have a meaning.
Yeah.
But that meaning is a moving target, depending on the time, depending on the age.
In a strictly legal framework, language is incredibly important,
Yes.
and rightfully. Like we benefit greatly from having exact language. It's great. You have two parties enter an agreement, consideration given by both parties, and you have a very, very clear, direct set of terms set out in a legal framework that benefits everyone, not just the parties involved, but the world in general, because we have contractual obligations between people that can be fulfilled. Unfortunately, when you mix two different languages in a framework, that can lead to honest misinterpretations.
Well, can I take that just for a second?
Sure. Yeah,
And
you're the lawyer.
exactly, and really, like, in the context of the treaty,
Yeah.
it would be like two people talking to each other. One's talking in Māori and one's talking in English.
Yeah.
Or in Te Reo in English. And they say, and I'm just going to do it in English because I can't actually speak to it.
Let's do it.
Yeah, sure, I'll give you governorship. That's perfect that you're giving us sovereignty. I'm so glad I'm giving you a governorship, and I'm so glad you're giving sovereignty. Okay, let's shake hands.
Yeah.
And to a lot of people, that's what happened
Yeah.
with the interpretation of the
Yeah.
treaty, right? And that's kind of
Yeah.
a real example of what you're saying around if your contractual terms are uncertain,
Yeah.
throw in two different languages to make it more certain. Don't think so.
No.
Like
no,
that's
no.
just going to make it even
No.
worse.
And we're talking early days of translation.
Correct.
We're not talking like 2 generations down the track. We're talking 1. Not even 1.
That-
We're talking
yeah,
people
the
who
generation that learns.
They've never seen a person from Europe and they're heading to a land to sign something.
Yes.
I mean, the idea of signing, the idea of a written form of communication, brand spanking new. There's no nuanced understanding of the legal ramifications of these things. Like, hea te, kaupapa o te kuini. What is the even concept of a queen? What is that?
Which you mentioned earlier about how the Māori chiefs were contracting with the Queen.
Yeah.
And how from a Crown perspective, it was known that the Queen delegates authority.
Yeah.
To the Crown, so the Queen is the figurehead, but then
to her
really
representatives.
it's representatives locally that are going to deal with it. She's just going to rubber stamp, really.
Yeah.
But for Māori at that time, they didn't have democracy in the way that the English were spreading democracy through the world. So then they would have seen the Queen more as like, I'm contracting with you personally, rather than I'm contracting with this thing, the Crown.
Your people are not doing what they said they would do.
Yeah, sorted out.
Yeah.
The way that a chief
but
would have sorted out
there's
within
nothing irrational about that.
I think it's a totally. I mean,
there were multiple deputations.
Yeah, it's consistent with
Māori
their
got
world
there
experience.
very quickly. We're talking within 10 years of sighting colonists. They were already doing that.
Yeah.
Pre-treaty. And so it's not something that was hard to fathom that these people are representing Queen Victoria. We need something. And the idea of a treaty was born out of that because there was issues straight away. So Māori did not struggle to contemplate the idea of rangatiratanga, the idea of chieftainship, the idea of delegated authority, but they also understood that the buck stops with Queen Victoria.
So when the complications started happening,
but they were encouraged to do this by priests, by people who would come here as missionaries. They were encouraged, a lot to make deputations.
It's interesting.
But they're not wrong. It was common back then. Like, there was no treaty. The idea of a treaty being signed, it hadn't happened. And I mean, we've spoken about this before, but it's 2025. The treaty was signed 185 years ago, if my maths is correct.
And it always is.
Well, I'm hoping it was. Yeah, it's about that, right? 185 years ago in February. It was officially signed and then further signed. The thing is, what treaty do you know is still referred to in law, in legal debates and terms, ever in the world that is more than that old, or that old at least, or even close to it?
Well, and treaties were never designed.
No.
To I don't know if ever designed, but treaties, a lot of treaties are only designed to achieve an end.
Yeah.
So it's transactional rather than long-term relationshipal. Now that's...
Yeah, but then you tell that to the people that wrote the articles of the treaty.
Yeah.
And every single one of those is talking about a basis of relationship.
100%. And it's also vibes. Like, if I was to use a word that is difficult to interpret,
vibes.
Very, very strong legal term. Yeah. But it's come under our blanket.
Yeah.
And keep everything that's yours, because that's cool. But just come under our blanket.
Yeah.
And then we'll make the rules for everyone, so that it's fair on everyone. And if you want to sell your land, make sure you sell it to us. And in return, I will protect you. That idea sounds really nice, but it's a good example of a very simple contract that has a lot of ways. Like, if I was to, because I love Marvel, it can take tangents, it can deviate from that line.
If you're an objective person who knew nothing and had no skin in the game, you'd look at that and go, that's a keep the peace thing, let's make an actual constitution now.
I could not agree more that the opportunity
they had a window
to do it,
to figure it out.
Yeah.
Māori were incredibly active with the law. So the moment the treaty happens, we see breaches occur. And Māori were incredibly active participants in the treaty to see those breaches remedied. And 20 years later, we have war. As a result of that war, we have, deemed by every single review ever as being illegal, as being invalid, confiscations of land. Every single one of them being an illegal and an invalid confiscation
As
of
in
land.
terms of historical analysis of the
As
of
in
that
not
wars.
even much longer after.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, that's my reading of history.
I don't have an alternative position to put forward.
The thing is,
Would be the way
it
to
is
characterise it.
an overwhelmingly... In 1926, you had a royal commission into... This is not the first one. This is just one of the more robust ones. Commission that inquired into illegal... But many colonists realised that grievances had occurred.
Yes.
And Māori were very active participants in the law. You're probably seeing today one of the lowest levels of participation of Māori in the process. And we're still having this debate now, but Māori ancestors have a very long and proud history of sticking up for their rights under the treaty. It was incredible the amount of history where they have stood up. I mean, in my parents' generation in 1953, they passed the Māori Settlements Act, or Māori Affairs Act, sorry.
Māori Affairs Act.
Māori Affairs Act. And if you boil it down, it says that if people can prove that Māori held land is unproductive, not really producing anything agricultural, you can force the government to force the sale, arbiter the sale,
Yeah.
and adjudicate that whole thing with a third party or themselves. And then in 1970, it was either 1970 or 1973, we have the Māori Affairs Amendment Act, which further empowers. So we're talking like if you had older siblings, it would be their generation.
Yeah.
Like not long ago. Not long ago at all.
Not that long ago.
Forcing sales of unproductive land
Yes.
through the Crown. There's no way that would happen now.
Well,
If
and
I said to you, Simon, that paddock out the back, mate,
You're not
you've
really
not done
using it.
anything with it for 20 years. It is beautiful land for dairy. And all you've got is a trampoline out there doing nothing. You need to sell that to me because it's unproductive. That is how ridiculous. And I feel like I'm oversimplifying it. I am, but the point is the same. I have no right to question your use of your land. You would back me up.
yeah. Well,
If I was
yeah.
breaking bylaws
Yeah.
and I was using it to grow marijuana or process batteries and I was leaching stuff into the soil, I'm breaching bylaws, and you'd have grounds to not force me to sell the land to you, but you'd have grounds to say you're breaching the use of land.
Yeah.
There's covenants about how you can use the land, and you're wrong, and I'm gonna use the power of the law to enforce that because the bylaws are there for a reason. But you have no right to say that's unproductive. It should be productive, and I want it.
You know what's really interesting about that is the transition from restrictions that we're comfortable with versus restrictions that we're not comfortable with. So when we look at those three examples of leaching into the soil, doing something naughty on the land, or doing something unproductive, they're all just versions of things to do with your land. But now we wouldn't accept forcing someone to sell their property. But we
No.
would still hold other covenants and
But
other restrictions.
Abatement is one thing.
Oh, no, and don't
Like
get me
your
wrong,
noise
I'm
is
not,
bad, your pollution's bad.
and I'm not advocating
Yeah.
that we should go backwards.
Yeah.
But there's always a line where we stop. Like it's a continuum. Like rights in respect of, say, land is a continuum, not absolute. So like I own this land.
Based
But-
on what?
Well, so that's a separate question.
No.
which I'm gonna
I don't mean anything personal. I just mean you're basing that upon like very basic legal concepts such as private property ownership.
Oh, correct.
And I'm fine with that. You're also basing it on the idea of enforceable contracts.
Yes.
If we take those two things out, we have anarchy. So I don't think anyone's questioning those two things as being a basis for really good ways to live and enforce contractual law between each other. Okay, if you don't have that, you can't depend on your assets. You have no value in your land if you can't prove that you own.
Well, you've got no certainty.
So I'm not. Private ownership is the basis of us being able to transact the way that we do, and there's probably not a person with a sound mind who questions that. Welcome if they do. But when you can, if I said to you, your land is unproductive, it's now up for sale, that is breaching that.
Yeah, no. So, but
it's very different to
yeah.
You're a pain.
No, I understand what you mean. What I'm saying is that I own the land, but I still can't do whatever I want on the land. And like even today.
Yeah.
It's like I can't do whatever I want. And being able to sell someone else's land is a version of you can't do whatever you want on your land. It's a crazy example of a restriction. So, because what it's saying is that you can own land as long as you use it productively.
Is there a difference between doing and not doing? Because doing something which is a negative externality, i.e. leaching things, reducing the enjoyment of land adjacent to yours, all grounds for abatement notices. Not doing something, but look, there's probably a couple of examples like letting weeds grow and being past levels of grass in urban areas. I get it.
It's a really good...
But not doing something and doing something, very different things.
See, but I would argue...
Negative externalities, positive externalities. Have we ever had law, yes, we have, which allows people to challenge the ownership of land because it could be really good, but you're just not using it that way?
Obscene. It's obscene, right?
1973.
Yeah.
If I'm wrong, it could be 1970, but... We literally had law that allowed people to take Māori ownership of land. Not any land, just Māori ownership, by the way.
Well, and that's what transitions into what we would consider today to be unacceptable.
But
you know what I mean?
Not even talking long ago.
No.
So 2 years later, in 1975, you have the Waitangi Tribunal Act, which is allowed to investigate and make recommendations on, I don't know what the word is. I'm not a lawyer, but they make recommendations on settlements to do with grievances about the treaty prior to 1840.
Yeah, and probably the only thing...
1985, they passed the law saying we'll go from 1840 as well. Open it up.
The only thing I'd add in there is that it formed the tribunal outside of the normal apparatus of the Crown.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a court. It's not part of the executive branch. Separate tribunal created in order to assess the grievances and then give recommendations.
And I
recommendations back to the Crown.
I actually think it's phenomenal. It is actually a world class thing we have.
It was we
can't lose it.
No, and it's so sad where we're currently at with the tribunal. I honestly haven't kept up enough in the last 2 weeks with exactly where things have stood with the change in personnel. This year.
It was formed, the Waitangi Tribunal.
It's an important apparatus, and it's really important that it's used for the purpose for which it was formed to be used, in order to assess, well, this would be my opinion, in order to assess the past grievances, address them, and provide recommendations so that we can hopefully move forward together as one people.
Provide recommendations. This is not a carte blanche open checkbook. And a lot of New Zealanders are misled to think that the Waitangi Tribunal is this free-for-all for anyone. The amount of work it takes to get something to the Waitangi Tribunal is eye-wateringly difficult.
As in for the applicants who are wanting to get there.
There's no one else.
Yeah.
The burden is on the applicants. The people who serve on the Waitangi Tribunal, you read and listen to those interviews. It's life-changing experiences for these people. Pākehā Māori. People don't understand, but Māori have been fighting for decades, centuries, to have a voice to be able to explain that we are living in a world now formed. And please don't forget, there were massive... By the way, the word grievance is not enough. It's too small a word to describe the life-changing effects by some random people at a time, in the 19th century mainly, but also since, that made decisions that benefited just a few random people, but disenfranchise enormous generations of Māori. And we are living and breathing in a world where we are experiencing firsthand the repercussions of some of those grievances. Look, we can all agree that doesn't give people carte blanche to just be victims about everything. But you'd be remiss to say there's not a connection. You'd bury your head in the sand. Look, to go to the Waitangi Tribunal and to be successful, to be heard, is a huge challenge. You don't understand, a lot of people don't understand the enormous work of generations of preparation it takes, of volunteer time and money to get to the point where you can be heard on the tribunal. The amount of work it takes to follow that process, you don't understand it. It is enormous.
Well, it's not something that you decide on Tuesday you're going to do, and the following Monday you've got a hearing date. That's for sure. It's a slow process, takes time. I mean,
there's so many stakeholders.
And the competition within Māori is difficult.
The government tries, rightfully, arguably.
Oh yeah, no, not belittling it.
The government wants to have very definite groups of people they want to deal with. And I am speaking out of turn here, I don't know the ins and outs, but a classic example is Ngāpuhi, Northern Tribal Affiliation. I think that's the best way to describe it, because you have so many grievances, so many hapu, so many representatives of iwi, and I don't think you could say people are invalid. They have very different points of view, and there's been a very real struggle to bring about a conformity there, because at its heart there is no conformity. But the government wants there to be this one ruranga, this one applicant, in a grievance, and there are grievances that have been heard, but they haven't been complete.
Yeah.
Well, there are people in areas where they're going, well, no, my family, my hapu, my iwi are not represented in this claim. We have further claims to make. So it's very hard to draw the line there, and I don't think it's helpful to think we should just be drawing lines. But at the end of the day, the Treaty of Waitangi Principles Bill is what we're meant to be talking about.
Yeah.
And here's the thing.
Yeah.
Like, I think, broadly speaking, you've got real claims by iwi and hapu that are being heard, that have been heard, that need to be heard. And I'm going to be honest, I'm really sad, because it's really hard to even have them be heard now, because so much time has elapsed and so much knowledge has been lost. And I take my hat off to every single person involved in those processes, because there's so much beautiful knowledge that even just in the last 20, 30 years has been lost.
In terms of the history of the
very
people
real
from the
history.
eras. Yeah.
Oh, you try and piece together something that happened in 1830 something.
You
Can't do that in your own family, let alone in a well-documented period of time where written language was not like 30 years later wasn't permitted. Māori children weren't at Native Schools Act. We whitewash it. It wasn't a big deal. It was a big deal. They weren't allowed to write and speak in Te Reo Māori. In 1986, the Māori language was seen as a taonga, and represented by the tribunal recommended that it be seen, and we see some pretty systemic changes in the rescuing of Te Reo Māori in New Zealand culture, and it led to the formation of Kohanga Reo, of which I unwittingly am a very, very happy person who was able to be a part of that.
When
soon
you say
after.
Kohanga Reo, can you just clarify what that is?
Kohanga Reo literally means like a nest of language.
Yeah, right.
So I went to Kohanga Reo before the Kohanga Reo were kind of really a thing, like represented by the government and funding, but you already had like very active Māori groups throughout New Zealand, everywhere. You had amazing people forming groups in their marae to sustain language, and you had kuia, which they've done for hundreds of years, look after the young people, kaumata. So I had nannies look after me. And my first proper language I learned at 2 or 3 years old was Te Reo Māori. Like it just flowed so beautifully. And obviously I learned English because I grew up in a really English household, but I was immersed for years at Kohanga Reo, at Tawhiti Nui Marae and Tauranga Moana, Whakamarama, learning this beautiful language. And I just took it for granted. But looking back, I'm so stoked that I had that experience because And Kohanga Reo really just grew from there. So you had preschool, well, not preschool, but you had preschool age childcare availed, funded partially by the government to go, we should put money into helping preschool age children have exposure to Te Reo Māori and Māori communities. And those nannies that we had at the marae, it's amazing. I haven't lived in Tauranga for years. 30 years away, I moved back at the height of COVID. I'm sitting there at the COVID centre getting my jab. It's a good citizen. Getting the jab. And the nurse who came to see me, volunteer, just out there for the good of the community, qualified nurse, came to me and said, I see your name. Like, are you a twin? And I went, yeah, I am. She said, is your mother like so-and-so? Did you go to Kohanga Reo in like Whakamarama at Tawhiti Nui Marae? And I'm like, I did. She's like, I remember you and your twin brother with the blonde hair and you guys, I remember your mum, she was awesome.
Classic.
And then one of my first clients ever down here was the Kohanga Reo of Pererako. And I told the guy, I said, it's pretty amazing you're one of my first clients doing sign writing for, because I actually went through your system. And he goes, man, hey, talk to the nannies, they remember you guys 30 years later. Such a beautiful community of people, and at their heart is this love for language, love for culture, love for reo, and it is just wonderful. And who would have thought, like, it could have been lost if that tribunal hearing had gone the wrong way. But the tribunal hearing heard that language, reo, was absolutely crucial and central to the future of Te Reo Māori in New Zealand and for New Zealand as a country. And it was made an official language even before English was.
Yes.
And I think 1990 it was made an official language along with sign language. So anyway.
Yeah, because a second ago you said about the process of the tribunal is it's a long process.
Yeah.
It's hard to do.
Extremely hard.
We now see a second generation of the claims that were settled in the 90s being relitigated and updated. And I would say that there's a number of people that are worried about that the deals that are done are not actually done, that they're open for reinterpretation, open to be further disputed.
I can't comment on that personally. Yeah. I don't know the ins and outs. I know that there are many claims that have still waiting to be heard that have never been heard.
Yeah.
So I don't know about relitigation.
Do you think that there's a pathway to settling claims fully?
Why don't we talk about the principles of the treaty as they pertain?
Yeah, right. Okay.
Because the tribunal, there's so much about that, and I'm just, I don't know. I mean, it's the ins and outs of every single case. And if you had a family wanting to settle something and you had 3 members talk about it, but then you heard that there were 2 members that were beneficiaries of that trust that were never heard and you never knew about because the documentation wasn't there. They said, hey, we need to relitigate this because you guys settled like a will, or you settled like a dispersion of assets, after a trust was, discontinued. And you're going, well, it's probably right. These 2 people have the day in court to explain why they were never considered.
That's a really good example, actually. But you know what's interesting about that is that if that was the case, the pool of money that went over here, there wouldn't be more money pumped in. It would be the pool of money would be redistributed to account for these other beneficiaries. So the value that's attributed to whatever the issue is, that would remain the same, but it would be redistributed around. And the grievance would not really be with this party, it would be with the other beneficiaries that have received everything. Which when you're dealing with a set amount of land.
So that's correct. But if you were to say, like, Ngāti so-and-so, I don't want to name names.
Yeah.
But Ngāti so-and-so or Ngāti whatever these guys have settled. They've settled. But then you had people who go, you do realise we're part of Ngāti so-and-so. And we have a very valid grievance we can prove. And we have decades of research, and we now have the ability to prove to you that this is now unsettled. And they're going, well, we're settled on this piece of land for this value and these recriminations, da da da. And then they go, well, but you're part of that. You're part of that iwi. We are. But you understand that our family, our hapu, that was never considered. And here are the grievances. And you dealt with that land over here to this border, but from here to there, we're part of that, and you haven't recognised that.
Yes,
that is very real.
No,
and I know
that,
of many instances.
I think that hits the nail on the head. Is that the
that
grievances?
That is not a discrete part of money.
No, but it is a discrete amount of land.
It is.
So, and I think that's where the distinction would be, is that if there's further claims against different parcels of land, those should always and continue to be heard by the tribunal.
Okay.
But if it's the same piece of land,
period. But why was Māori language as a tongue held by Māori as a whole, which arguably is not a thing. So Māori as a whole had language stripped away actively from them. Actively and non-actively and all sorts in between. And as a whole, it was understood by the tribunal to make a recommendation to the government that we need to redress this. And it has, and you know what? One of the only instances in the known world where language from an indigenous people has actually been resurgent.
Yes.
It's amazing. Not enough people know this, but it is incredibly rare to see indigenous language on the brink of, destitution and destruction brought back. It is incredibly rare. You can't put that down to anything other than the sheer will of Māori who understood that reo is not language, it is us, it is our culture. Ka ngaro te reo, if the language is lost, ka ngaro tawa we, people are lost. Pera I te ngaro o te moa, just like the disappearance of the moa. When you lose language, you lose people, you lose culture. Language is not words, it's not a written document. Language is culture and understanding. And here's the thing, we're talking about the principles of the treaty and what part do they play in our constitutional framework going forward. ACT have brought this to our attention, and they're not wrong. They're not wrong to bring it to our attention. Everyone's thinking about it. Because when you talk about Waitangi Tribunal and money, you get a lot of people who are misguided, in my opinion, very much my opinion, who think, oh my God, I can't believe we're still giving money to Māori 185 years later, blah, 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 blah. I tell you what, if you said that to a Scottish clan who lost their land and their people, I'm Scottish, man, I can claim this. Like, bro, the clearances were real.
Yeah.
Like, you can't say that to a Scottish clan. It's real. They're going to remember that utu for 500 years. So why are we still talking about the treaty? Because it hasn't been honoured. And it hasn't. We haven't lived up to it as a Crown representative. Victoria abdicated her responsibility to be the person who made sure that the Crown responsibilities were lived up to. It hasn't been lived up to. The language, the
when
loss
you
of
say
language,
it hasn't been lived up to, do you
grievances,
do you mean
large scale,
past grievances, or do you mean that
from 1840 onwards?
Yeah, and because I mean, if we, like in the 1970s, in tandem with the resurgence of language was a cultural shift of acknowledging the treaty grievances at an institutional Crown level, enshrining those in legislation, and then the formation of the principles as a way of interpreting moving forward how it's going to be dealt with. The Public Works Act was the biggest key to that fundamental shift in the way legislation was drafted in New Zealand, because it meant that, not the Public Works Act, the State-Owned Enterprises Act, because what it was is that you couldn't sell a state-owned enterprise without taking into account the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi
and Māori land.
Yes.
Māori land is forbidden to be for sale without consultation with local.
And so that was, when that was drafted, the principles were ideas. Is how I would characterize them. Rather than principles, these are the things that we should be taking into account. These are the ideas that we should be turning our minds to.
The elephant in the room is that we are saying that all citizens are equal before the law. That is the sticking point in this principles debate, right?
Well,
we're all equal.
I think the presumption
undermining that is saying, cool, Māori have no longer special representation
rights
in governmental policies. So Waitangi Tribunal over here, governmental recognition of treaty principles when applying and thinking about government mandates, government plans, government spending, government budget, government ideas. Informing that at a constitutional level is understanding the treaty principles. And so David Seymour, the ACT Party, there's a lot of pressure there to go, can we just agree what the treaty principles are? Because we don't want vagueness. They're not wrong. We don't want insecurity. They're not wrong. We want everyone to be the same in the eyes of the law. Not wrong, but what there's a deep fear of is that says no longer can Māori have special privilege to assert their rights of the treaty. And it says clearly that's not going to happen for grievances, But I wonder what the success is of a tribunal hearing being heard by government, like recommendations about the language, if it was to happen under those principles, because everyone is the same in front of the law.
Well, and the question, I guess, then is, if it's part of reparations and reparations are excluded, moving forward, does the treaty enshrine special legal status for Māori in perpetuity? Now, I'm not saying either way.
A lot of Māori would say that's what the treaty said.
Yeah, and I think that's the core question, that whenever I'm talking to people about this, that is where it comes unstuck. And how do you recognise that? Because at the end of the day, like, another thought I had today as I was driving home was Māori population is growing. So again, much like how the language is resurgent,
proportionately growing as
Māori
well.
population is growing, and I would claim disproportionate to, well, it's growing, and there's no sign that Māori are going to stay the percentage of the country that it currently is.
It's growing again, but it went from being this percentage to almost wiped out, and then it's growing again.
Well, but that percentage was only because there was not many of anything else. Whereas then
they also died of very curable diseases
because
of very poor health outcomes, and we got down to less than 50,000 Māori.
Yeah, so I think
it was actually
I
on
think
the
it
level
got down to about
of
43,000 was at its lowest point.
We're talking, and we don't like to talk about it, but at the end of the day, Māori health was unbelievably. It was a classic case of colonialism. No excuses given to colonials who moved here, but at the end of the day, they moved here, and the exact same thing happened to Indigenous populations. Very healthy community with very few health concerns, all of a sudden started dying from very curable diseases. Right? We're talking pre-antibiotics.
Yeah.
Okay?
So I presume what you're saying is that the colonizers brought diseases with them that Māori had no.
Absolutely nothing ready to go. So we're talking no immunity, very healthy population, very, very robust health system. Colonists arrive and Māori it's insane, the level of decimation.
It's nothing compared to what we've got today. In terms of, and it was nothing compared to what was, say, in the UK
today,
at the time.
Today it's a lot better, but it's still very disproportionate.
No, but in terms of like the Māori health, the health system that existed before colonisers arrived versus the health system we have today.
It was an indigenous cultural health system. So it wasn't institutionalized on a national level.
Like proportionate to the time.
But what I'm saying is
relevant to the time.
What I'm saying is they didn't just die of the flu and the cold and smallpox. Like, these things happened after Europeans turned up here.
When they didn't exist, right?
They didn't exist.
They didn't have those.
They inherited those through no decision of their own. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but not just that. There was a deprivation of economic availability to health. So Māori were 99% rural, doctors were 100% urban, right? Like my own grandfather in the 20s was, paid by the Department of Health, not the ministry, but the Department of Health, very old dude, but he was taken around in a waka through Lake Waikaremoana, and he was a dentist that went round and brought dental care to Māori villages living on the perimeter in Suhui land. And he says it was the most magical experiences of his life. I mean, it was since flooded and a lot of those sort of villages have gone, but he was paid for as a young dentist to go around, and that was his job. Every year he would go around and provide dental services to remote villages on a boat. Like he had no other means to get there. And the thing is, they didn't have dental problems that we know of until we had, vast amounts of carbohydrates, growing and yada yada. But at the very crux of what we're talking about, you're talking about very specific grievances of the treaty pertaining to rohe areas and people. But here's the thing: what do the principles mean?
No. So what I was trying to get to is that you've got a resurgence of population.
Yeah.
So Māori population is growing. Likely position in 50 years is that we're going to have a higher percentage who identify as Māori in the New Zealand population.
They're thinking mid-20s.
Yeah. Is it just that we just need to sit back and let time pass, and there'll be more Māori, a bigger percentage? Like, do we need to solve this now and clarify the principles now, or do we just need to let time pass? There'll be a broader, I'm struggling to find a different word other than assimilation, but where Māori,
I mean, you're talking,
and so then you've got more voting, you've got
statistically,
people
you want to talk
who
about
want
averaging out things.
Do we need to worry about it now?
I'll ask you these questions, and then you tell me what the answer is. Māori, I don't know what the percentage is now, but whatever it is, somewhere between 15 to 20% of the population identify as being of Māori descent. But we have a huge...
I think it's just over 20.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a huge disproportionate representation of Māori in prison.
We're about 50%, correct. In violent crime stats.
That is actually really jarring. We have an incredible disproportionate amount that are unemployed, underemployed, and not leaving paid for by the state, by Māori. So Māori are paying for things through their taxes. Okay.
Everyone's paying for things through their taxes.
This is what I'm saying. Māori are as well. So one of the biggest taxes we have in New Zealand is the GST tax. And people on lower incomes disproportionately pay a higher amount of GST than wealthy people because they save less and pay more in goods and services. So as a proportion of their income, they spend more. One could argue that a VAT or a GST tax is regressive, and repressive. But no, it's a well-known argument that value-added tax is a regressive taxation system on the poor, because I pay the same as Joe Bloggs and the other Joe Bloggs. I could be a middle income. That guy could be on $1 million a year, save 90% of it, and so he spends less. But I might spend 50%, 80% of my income on goods and services, and someone on a low income is expected to spend 100% of their income on goods and services of disposable income once they paid for rent or mortgage. So it is a regressive taxation system. So Māori are really disproportionately represented in lower income households and lower income individuals, and therefore are actually paying a high amount of tax for their overall income. If you said, if you earn $100, you earn $100, you earn $100, or whatever amount, percentage, you would calculate that they pay a high percentage in tax.
Correct.
To their income. So there is an enormous spend by Māori on taxation, but we don't have what the treaty principles bill is being criticised for, amongst other things, but the one I find really, really hard is this very crafty thing saying we're all equal before the law, because you can use that clause the principle 2 or 3, I can't remember. But you can use that to say we shouldn't have a healthcare system, an education system, a prison system, an income system, a rebate system on benefits available through social security. We shouldn't allow any of these to be defined upon being Māori or non-Māori. And I 100% disagree with that as a partner in the treaty. As a Pākehā man living in New Zealand, aware of my privilege of not having a Māori last name and finding it easy to get interviews and CVs, and not having a generation of people who struggled through being abused, through being stolen from, we're talking in the early days, of being like marginalized, of being, what we're talking about now is being generalized, putting into categories. I know Māori friends who change their last names on their CV because they have a higher chance of using their mum or someone's Pākehā last name to get an interview. So that's 2025, 2024, and we're still living in a world where it's easy to get an interview when you have a Pākehā last name other than a Māori, Indian or Chinese last name, right?
Well,
that is the world we live in.
Well,
that's the privilege that they don't have.
But there's a quick sleight of hand you've done there by saying that Pākehā last name, because my last name's Hungarian, and I got told not to put my last name on CVs.
Look,
when I left law school, so it's actually
you're probably part of that.
But I mean, that's
like,
not to
if
say
your
I'm
last
part
name
of,
was Thompson,
correct,
Edmonton, English, I don't know, like my last name's perfectly Anglo-Saxon.
So the question then is it a needs-based system or is it a race-based system that we're looking for?
Well, the treaty would say that there is a race-based understanding that as Crown partners, we have an agreement to make sure that we are not ruining the chances and that we're not being bad treaty partners with people that we signed for. And those are the iwi of the Māori tribes of New Zealand. Double words there. But here's the thing. It's not wrong. It's not wrong for our politicians to question that. It's not wrong. It's like, hey, what have we got here? We got a two-party thing. Like what? Pacifica don't get a go? Pacifica immigrants that we've got some answering to do there. We do.
Well, and Pacifica
right?
immigrants there. Well, Pacifica are represented worse in a lot of health stats and a lot of poverty stats.
Truly,
Asian communities.
We've got some history there, but every country struggles with groups of immigrants that then are marginalised somehow, intentionally, unintentionally, somewhere in between, mixture of both. Generally speaking, it's a thing, and none of us are exempt. But Māori signed a treaty of understanding with the Crown, and we have failed as Crown partners, and I see myself in that because I am a direct descendant of the people that came here. We came here pre-treaty, so I'm really related to the people that came here and were a part of the generations. I don't know what my family did, but I know that we were beneficiaries of a system that suited us, but really didn't suit people that already existed here in New Zealand. And I think what Māori are asking is that the treaty principles represents not just specific grievances about land, and you talk about discrete land and trusts and whatnot, but also that we look that the only reason we're having this debate now, 2025, is because of those statistics. And it's not by chance, some random thing to do with Māori genes, that Māori are underrepresented in all of these social things that lead to success and quality of life. Some of the highest suicide rates in the world are amongst Māori and amongst Māori youth and young men.
Well, and the other correlation is poverty. And I reckon
home ownership.
I would go so far as to say that the biggest single connecting similarity is poverty. So race, and if we put it in the New Zealand context, what we're saying there is because a group of people were alienated from land that would have allowed them to have generational wealth. Let's say if you compare security, like if you compare a different
the
world.
trauma of being poor?
Yeah. So if you had that, you wouldn't have the poverty and the lack of wealth that then has passed generation. The other thing that comes with that is time. So I find that so one of my big privileges is being able to cook.
Yeah.
I'm convinced of. Because
can I just say, you are a really good cook. And I have been telling everyone about your cooking skills from that beautiful two-course meal you did.
Shucks.
No, I mean it. You are a good cook, sir.
Well, but that's privilege, because
Yeah, it's
what
my
it
privilege.
means is, yeah, it's your privilege. Like a time
Yeah.
to learn. My parents had time to teach me.
Yeah.
I grew up a pretty simple but very comfortable childhood. But we were able to have special dinners.
Yeah.
So some dinners were, I said this to someone the other day, that we had rice risotto Tuesday or rice risotto Wednesday.
You know.
And I was reflecting on like Chinese spice rice risotto. And,
Oh,
that
right.
was just like a meal, you know?
I'm there. I know.
And I
It's
loved
a perfectly
it.
good
and
meal.
Perfectly good meal. And now I think back
Yeah.
on it and I'm like, man, that was such like a perfect, cheap, just average Kiwi meal.
Yeah,
But then we did have special dinners.
It's
then,
so good for a parent, though. When you come home and all you need to do is throw in a couple of those
100%.
facts, add water, and not take up real estate in your brain about thinking
Yeah.
about other things.
Yeah,
In the
100%.
80s and 90s, you didn't have to have vegetables in your rice risotto.
Nah,
You could just do it.
It was,
Chuck
but it
in
was,
some
it
mixed
was
veggies.
bougie if to get in some broccoli in there or something. It
Oh.
was like, ooh, mum,
Are you
you've gone
like-
done me dirty.
Broski.
Yeah,
How's
so
the-
so that time to be able to do things that aren't work, aren't
Yeah.
surviving, right? And that's how we came out of the fields and into the modern civilization that we live, is that we figured out how to farm so that then not everyone had to be living hand to mouth.
Yeah.
And that is part of the poverty cycle, is that it's just head down. It's
Yeah.
just, I've just got to get through the day. I can't even afford to think about an EV car. I can't even afford to
People
think
don't
about this and-
understand about, like, evolution is real. I mean, I believe in evolution. Okay, so like biological evolution is real, but passing on things from one generation to another is statistically incredibly real. So you know the rhesus monkeys
Oh,
study.
yeah.
So a terrible study. I mean, there's been other really
Is this
better
the one where
studies.
they hit them or they sprayed them with water when
I'm
they
not
tried
sure
to
about
climb
that.
up?
No, look, it sounds like the rhesus monkeys had a very
I feel like they did more
terrible
than one
statistically
monkey
scientific thing, and I feel really bad for the rhesus monkeys, but like really bad. But one of the studies that you keep hearing about, and there have been other better studies, but the classic one they talk about is this: that rhesus monkeys who exhibit some of our things, but we're way more like that. They demonstrate that in this study they had rhesus monkeys that had access to their parents, and they have a thing called lick and
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's like,
groom, lick and groom.
Yeah, lick and groom.
So
yeah.
lick and groom. So they had access to their mothers. The other third had a wire mum
Yes, I do know this.
covered in fur that looked approximated a mother, but was static and a fixed object. And the end result was, I'm gonna like bastardize the study, but the end result was they were a little bit like chaotic. They showed like what we call as chaotic attachment syndrome. So they didn't attach well, and then they had a third set, and God bless these poor rhesus monkeys, but they were completely deprived of any contact with other monkeys, let alone their parents. And they completely and utterly lost their brains and died early, and were just absolute psychological messes. And they've repeated studies like this, but
And the lick and groom group, they licked and groomed the next generation.
that's it.
So,
The next
so what they
generation
discovered
licked
is
and
that it's a
groomed.
totally social,
It
it's
is
not
a
a
learnt
biological
behaviour.
thing, it's a learnt behavior.
Evolution
Yeah.
is not just biological; it is also sociological.
Yeah.
So evolution, even genes that support certain behaviors, go hand in hand, and they cannot be separated. So, look, the things you can take from that study, all numerous, and people make all sorts of claims. But one of the classic things is behavior is learnt. So I don't want to make a giant anthropological leap, but if you come from a family that never ever went to university and valued tertiary education as a means to then just achieve or do something else in life, and you live in a country that makes it pretty accessible, right?
100%.
Like, we're not 100%, but like if your grades weren't great at high school, there is a path. It's hard,
Yeah.
but there is a path.
Well, and there's something.
There is
You might not be
something.
able to go to
And-
law school
and
or
you could do an
engineering
extra
or something.
year, even if you were pretty shit at high school. You could then do that year and go, whoa, okay, cool, you're on it, man. Let's just keep going. And we have that, and certain governments have made it easier. Some have made it a little bit harder financially. But at the end of the day, we're in a fairly like low barrier country compared to
Yes.
many countries. So the idea is that tertiary education is very much learnt behaviour from your parents. And it is really, really, really unusual. It's statistically unusual to find people to complete meaningful tertiary education if their parents or other antecedents didn't do it.
I remember as a young man, I found
And you
it
can-
very
yeah.
annoying when people would say that they can't afford to go to university, because I would go, it's interest-free loan. You can get a student allowance if you're on a low-income family, which you don't have to pay back. So then you can go and live somewhere. And also if you're in Auckland or Wellington or Hamilton or Christchurch, you can just live at home. And I remember
Yeah.
getting so agitated
I hear
about
that.
it. As I get older, and that learning
That
and
thinking that you just described
a lot of
is
people stay in
learnt
that.
behaviour.
Yeah.
Like, do you know how-
But it's
No,
also
I'm
being
sorry,
young.
but-
It's not appreciating. It's looking at your circumstance and saying, why isn't everyone else thinking the way I'm
Do
thinking?
you know,
That's
you know
what it
how
is.
hard it is for someone that never thought of those things you just listed to think of those things you just listed?
Yeah,
Like
no,
and I
exactly.
admire the fact you grew up in a world, and so did I, that was like, mate, if you wanted your uni, it's there.
Yes.
But if you grow up in a world where no one ever said that to you,
You just
you're
don't
just listening
even-
to some teachers who are like privileged say that, you're like, fuck off.
Yeah, you just
My
don't
family
even
don't do that. No one's ever done that. Fuck off. My dad wants me to go and work at the mobile because we need to pay the rent.
Yeah.
And
I've got
I
bigger
get
problems.
it. He's real. He's not wrong. I need to pay the rent. I'm here. My mum's doing all the cooking. I need to go and pay some bloody rent.
Yeah.
Like,
The
that's
power
not wrong.
the power of knowledge.
Bro, like,
It's crazy.
I hate to sound woke, but we live in a privileged world where we think tertiary education is not actually that hard to do. Like, and you're frustrated that people complain, and you're right. You're not wrong.
Well, and was frustrated, just to clarify.
Okay, yes.
That's me when I was in my early 20s.
But like, actually, that's still fine to be upset about that because people do think tertiary education is hard, and I'm like, I'm just angry that you think it's hard because, man, like, you're a smart person. Like, your mum, like, she was amazing. You're amazing. You can do this.
I
And
get
they're
more
like,
mad
nah,
at the
man, I'm just
situation.
gonna have kids now. I'm a mum. I'm just gonna have kids. And I'm like, I get it, but you should definitely go back to that because you're bloody good at this. And for someone to make that leap, we're like, oh, you're just like squandering an opportunity. But that is actual privilege that you grew up thinking that was not even a challenge.
One and a good example of that, there was, I think it's an experiment, or I don't know if it's just a thing with little flies, like little mozzies or whatever. I can't remember exactly what they did it with, but they basically they could jump a certain height, and then they put them in a jar with a lid, and so they would only jump, and then they would hit, but then they would stop, and they would stop just for, and then they had like offspring or whatever. The offspring would never hit the roof. They would only ever jump as high as their parents, and I think that really sums it up. Is that like what you do
You
as a
should leave with
parent?
that. Why did we even talk about? Nah.
Right? Because
That's brilliant.
Like
Yeah.
you're just to
Yeah.
push past what
Yeah.
your parents
Yeah.
tell you is the ceiling.
That glass ceiling.
That glass ceiling, and like
it's-
for families,
Yeah.
for sexes, for races, like
For
whatever.
people running races, the 4-minute
Yeah.
mile
Yeah.
was like this thing. It's bizarre to think that was a ceiling.
But then like when someone broke it, it was like 20 people in the space of like 3 months broke it. It was like as soon as it was done, everyone was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, we can do that. Oh, sweet,
Yeah.
cool. I'll just go do that then.
And that, I think, just illustrates the power, the prevailing power of the context in which you were brought up in. So
Yes.
imagine being Māori and you'd never, ever seen someone in your whānau or wider whānau leave the community, be very successful in a contract Western world, but you might have heard of one person or two, but it wasn't something that was like ingrained as this is a normal path for you. And you're going to be that sandfly that hits a pretend ceiling, and I'm like, that's a massive generalization. Look, I'm from a very poor, like, family, but I was blessed because, like, it wasn't. I saw opportunity around me, and I didn't think that was my limit, because it was only my one family. It wasn't like my extended family. It wasn't like this systemic thing. But I can so easily see if that was one more generation of that systemic. I don't know. I can see myself not contemplating being outside of that.
Well, once you have your grandparents and your parents
Yeah.
telling you how it is,
Yeah.
as a young person, you form your opinions primarily off them, or whoever it is. It doesn't have to be direct family, but it
Yeah.
could just be whoever those people are in your life. So
Yeah.
to break out of that, it's massive.
So
And
do we need as a country to have a treaty principles bill that potentially takes away from Māori having the right to be seen as treaty partners that were not looked after, and that they are equal with everyone in front of the law and there's no special law for them, when we know that we are living in a world statistically incredibly dominated by a group of people that have not had that background, that have been sandflies trapped in a jar with a lid? Or do we need to challenge the Treaty Principles Bill from saying we're all equal, everyone can bloody fly as high as they like, there's no jar lid, that's just pretend, it's in your own mind? And we're going, well, hang on, didn't we put a jar lid on top of those mosquito sandflies for the last 180 years? Don't we have, as treaty partners, an obligation to say, hey, we're bloody sorry that you, like, it's really hard because it's 180 years, but we're not talking about the Treaty of Versailles anymore. We're not talking about the treaty after the 30 Years' War, because things moved on. Things have not moved on for Māori today.
And I think, like, something I'd pick out of what you just said, which is like the partnership with Māori, and just correct me if I mischaracterise, but the partnership with Māori, it's important to recognise the obligations that are owed on the basis of what was agreed.
Yeah.
Now, if we were honouring the principles of the treaty, let's just say that focusing on making sure that Māori communities and the needs of Māori communities were being looked after, like we should be doing for every community in New Zealand, there's an argument that we wouldn't even be having this conversation because those shortfalls just wouldn't exist. So like the overrepresentation in stats, it just wouldn't exist because the resources needed to remedy that acute problem now would be being put to that problem now.
Yeah.
And so that's, I don't know where we go with that. I don't know whether that contributes to yay or nay to a principal treaties bill, whether we need to actually rethink it in terms of integrating the principles that we currently have into a piece of legislation that actually formalises that these are the ones that we've decided that we're gonna play by, that we're gonna enshrine, whether we need a constitutional document that actually
the
elevates
actual bill
them.
doesn't say these are the principles.
No, and the interesting thing about the bill as a
It
concept,
leaves a lot of open ground for tribunal hearings. It doesn't try and curtail that.
No, it does, and it certainly doesn't. It doesn't curtail it.
Ah.
It certainly doesn't curtail grievances.
No.
Like under the treaty.
No.
But one thing that it does do is that it suggests, no, more than suggests, from when that bill passes, the way I interpret it would be that there's no grievances from now on.
Yeah, and that's
because
the
we're
big
all
fear.
equal. So Māori, like every other group, is going to be not lining up with hands out from the government, but just in terms of like for funding, every need of the community.
But the grievances that
So that's the question, is whether that's where we want to go, or whether we want to do something different, and that's the interesting conversation.
Would we not do better as a country with most people being on the right side of a health statistic? and a education statistic and an employment statistic, we would, right? Like we've got a
Surely.
problem. I don't
Yeah.
care if the treaty existed or not. If you can identify a people group who are being left behind, it's not rocket science to go, we need a set of policies that address this in that language for these people. A classic recent case is the COVID vaccines. Love it, hate it, paranoid, conspiracy theorist, somewhere in between, jury's out, whatever your opinion is, because there's a myriad out there. At the end of the day, we saw a very, 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 very bad uptake by Māori communities into the COVID vaccinations. It was highly problematic. We're talking very recently. There's a really, look, I don't want to go into COVID, but let's just say it was way more devastating. It's insane. If we had that happen again, we've lost the trust of the communities, and we can't deliver health outcomes that are, we didn't realise, but are made for a Pākehā world. We struggle in rural Māori communities. The uptake was so abysmally low at the beginning. It was
So what do we put that down to?
The government worked incredibly fast and hard, and somewhat unsuccessfully, to work with local Māori to help communicate that. But you're like, well, hang on, we just spoke to everyone. Oh yeah, how did you speak to them? Like what language? But what medium? How did you do it? And we're like, we did it the main way. The main way according to Pākehā and most people living in New Zealand.
Okay, so at what point do we go, the kaumātua and leaders in those communities have to be held responsible for translating into language that is going to make sense to their communities?
Great, let's give them the money to do it.
Yeah, okay, so
if you say that, there's an obligation that as taxpayers and as Crown partners, they're due something to do that.
And surely we would have the same obligation if Indian communities or other Asian communities or Pacifica communities had the same grievance. Yeah, but they do live in our country. And if we had the COVID situation and another ethnic group also didn't take up
I don't think a rational human would actually stand in the way of saying, oh my gosh, we've got this X community, whatever it is, that live here, and whatever we're doing is not working. They're New Zealand citizens, or whatever they are. They hear. This isn't good for them. It's not good for the country. Holy moly, these people from Xlandia, like that's completely irrational to think that we wouldn't do something in terms of a public health policy to address that.
So then
that's very normal.
So then do we need the treaty to make it different for Māori in that situation?
Or
do we just need to be better?
The treaty principles is already an existing understanding that as Crown partners, we have to understand that it is not a one-time monetary consideration for grievance for a piece of land. It's understanding, what does that lack of economic opportunity lead to? It's called colonisation. It's called the effects of that colonisation. Not a good colonisation. There are positive aspects to colonisation, right? But that colonisation process has been incredibly detrimental for Māori. And that's not contestable. It shouldn't be.
Well, that statement might not be contestable, but then what? Is very contestable.
But the thing is, Māori signed in good faith a treaty that process would be protected, and it wasn't.
And then
so they lost land.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll give you the land. We'll give you money for the land back 100 and something years later. But Tauranga owned purely by Māori. We're talking Cameron Road, Gate Pa, beautiful swath of land, just confiscated after the land wars, given to the church. The church said, "Oh, we can't do anything with this. Let's give it to the government." The government then sells it to people in parcels.
Which is really raising the question
is
the reparations under the tribunal, is that actually sufficient?
You lose all your livelihood. You lose members of your family in a war. Then you lose your livelihood. You are also under the subjugation of this oppressive government. And you can't characterise it as anything but that at the time. In the 1860s and 70s, it was not fun to be a Māori living in Waikato, Tauranga, parts of Auckland, King Country, and other parts of Taranaki, other parts of New Zealand. It was very unfun to be a Māori human being in that environment when you're arguably just fighting for your rights under the treaty to not give your land to people and be forced to sell. You're a rebel.
Yeah, and probably, I don't know if we can solve that at this point in the conversation.
I
feel
know,
like we're going to get into another deep
but what I
conversation
mean is
about
like that's the starting point, and there's so much that goes into that. But just take that and go, well, what do you think the logical effects are for their kid, the 4-year-old, who did nothing to do with the New Zealand Wars, living in what was then called something else, but is now named after a very oppressive person, named Greerton. That's the name of the town now. But probably, there's a lot of people saying it should be renamed. I get it. They're living there and they're like throwing off their land, and you're 4 years old and you've gone from some sort of like predictable lifestyle, and now you are like, you've lost several people in your family. And the next thing you know, you're fighting for survival. You have kids, they have kids, they have kids. World War I happens, World War II happens. You're beaten out of language. Next thing you know, you've got a bunch of people with zero economic background. They've just survived from generation to generation. You go, oh, it's your fault you haven't made it in this world.
No,
we don't owe you anything.
No, but that's not the thinking now, because that's the whole point of the tribunal, right? Like, well, that's in
it
principle.
is for that land.
But I think.
But
that,
as a human, it's
no. But I don't think you can
Okay.
say the treaty wasn't just about land, but the tribunal is just about land, because the tribunal was set up to right past grievances.
almost every grievance heard at the treaty tribunal,
Has
Waitangi
been
tribunal,
about land
has been
solely.
about
Now-
land grievances.
Now, the interesting question would be, why have we not addressed the broader cultural impacts
Those
as part
are
of
the
the settlements?
Principles
when-
treaty.
and
how
that's
do you,
what-
how do you have that
and
in a
that's-
Waitangi tribunal?
So, well,
How do you do that?
Well, but then how do you do it
We
in
did it with
reality?
Māori language.
Like, this is the challenging part. is that-
Foreshore and seabed, Māori language, 2 examples where a generic understanding that, whoa, major screw up here. And we understood that. But it's very hard to do that economically, other than let's enshrine some treaty principles that we live in a bicultural community. And bicultural is a weird term, but it literally means Māori and non-Māori. Non-Māori includes all immigrants, be Pākehā, and Pākehā doesn't mean white, but Pākehā does kind of mean white to us. But it actually includes all immigrants. It actually does,
but
technically.
That's problematic though, because not all immigrants contracted as part of the Crown.
But they came here under the
the Crown.
permission of the Crown. Every person here who has a passport has a passport under the jurisdiction of the Crown as our head of state.
Yep, that's
Sorry,
valid.
but that's every immigrant does. So you can very cleanly say Māori, Pākehā, and Pākehā being non-Māori. That's what the word meant. It does mean white and European in many interchanges. But it literally means not actually from here. And Māori was a strange word at the time, but it has become this conglomerate word that means people who lived here before, tangata whenua. Yeah. But you try putting 2 warring Scottish clans under the same umbrella, and it took a while for that to settle. And it's the same here in New Zealand. You had years of reprisals between families.
Conflict.
Yeah, it's just classic War of the Roses, War of the Iwi. I mean, we had wars between each other and every kind of little group
But
of
we
people
certainly don't want to go back there.
No.
And I think
we're not
that's, and we're past that.
But
and
the
that's
thing
probably something we need to seriously turn our minds to in terms of what we do now.
But the treaty was signed by Māori with the Crown. And they didn't like wait 100 years and then contest grievances. That started day one. You have a look at it. It's an incredible ability for Māori to pivot. After the signing of the treaty, after the signing of the treaty, Māori didn't wait 100 years and go, oh, hang on a second. That is a weird point of view that people have, but there is an incredible, rich history of protest, of grievance, and if anything, it's weaker now than it's ever been.
in terms
because
of
it's
actual
been
engagement.
180 years.
So this bill is going to go through its process. It's likely going to be unsuccessful.
It 100% will be unsuccessful.
Right.
Yeah. National's not supporting it as a
No,
party. It's
that-
gone for its first reading, select committee.
Yeah. So
Nothing wrong with that in a
so
democracy.
the question then is that the end of the conversation, or
No.
does the conversation carry on? Surely this is just the start of this next chapter. Like many things in
Yeah.
New Zealand culture, this
Yeah.
is the beginning of a bigger conversation for probably a long time.
Yeah.
Until we figure out the best way to deal with it.
And look, we can talk about the nuances of that bill. We can talk about the nuances of constitutional law in New Zealand, and that is a really thoroughly interesting conversation to have. But actually, at the heart of this whole thing is, what does it mean to be, in my mind, what does it mean to be a treaty partner now, as a person living in New Zealand?
Which is probably the question everyone needs to ask.
I actually think it does, and you may not
informing their
draw the
ideas.
same conclusions, but I personally am pretty overwhelmed with what it means that colonization was real. It's not like, oh, we colonized New Zealand somehow. Māori are just really badly represented in everything. It's weird. It must be in their genes. Like,
How did that happen?
but I know people who think that. They go, oh, it's a culture. It's a new culture. And I'm like, cool, but no, not
let's
cool at
say
all. Actually,
we can do better.
and look, we're talking about, you and I talked about this, but there's the farmer who studies farming around the world, goes to Outback Australia, studies the farms there, and then confusingly after his first day on this massive station in Outback Australia and near Alice Springs, you know, he's at the dinner table, all the cockies and farmers are there, and the head farmers there, and I said, how was it? Oh, it's amazing, like beautiful landscape, just incredible, breathtaking. But man, I got lost, not where I was. Where are the bloody fences? And he says, what do I need fences for when I've got wells? Because the fences are the bare minimum of where the cows can't go past. But they're not even thinking about where they're going because they're drawn to the source of water. So when we're talking about what are the limits of the Treaty of Waitangi, we're talking about what are those extremes in New Zealand law? What's the bare minimum we can do? Or as a really good treaty partner, somebody who says, hang on, why don't we focus on our main thing? We're treaty partners. We're living amongst people now who are still living in deprivation because of what happened then. And as an honouring part of that, if we just focus on that, do we even need to talk about the limits of these things? And I know as a legal person, you're like, we do, because contract is that. And look, that's really important, but I think political parties, anyone who says, well, hang on, Māori are really, really badly represented in these things, what the bloody hell are we doing? Can we change something? Because it doesn't matter if it's Māori, it does, but if it was people X, chances are we'd still be going, what are we going to do about this, guys? This can't be right. Right?
Dan, it has been such a pleasure talking to you.
I'm a talker. Sorry, man.
This is our lives, and
Yeah.
no doubt this won't be the last time we talk about this.
No,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Awesome.
It wasn't the first either.
yeah, exactly.
Just being real. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks,
Yeah.
brother.
No, awesome.
Good.
Thanks for having me.
If you've made it this far, I assume that you've found something that's at least been enjoyable, interesting, of dispute, something that's kept you for the last over an hour listening to us rattle on about this very interesting and very topical subject. If you've enjoyed, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for future videos, both interest pieces with guests sitting down with me to talk about difficult topics, and legal topics on fortnightly basis, talking about things that are hopefully going to be of a benefit to you. This podcast is only of value to those that see it, so please share, and remember, at LOA Law, we are good lawyers for good people.